He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even turn his head without the pain ripping through him like a blade. But when Dominic Corsetti opened his eyes in the dead of that night, the man who had ordered hits without blinking, who had built his empire on silence and fear, he felt something press against his hand. Warm, small, gentle. He looked down, and there she was, his maid, asleep. Her fingers curled softly around his like she was afraid he might disappear. For the first time in 20 years, Dominic Corsetti felt his chest crack open. If you've ever believed that the hardest person to love is the one who forgot how, stay with me. Subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The night Dominic Corsetti was shot, nobody cried. Not his lieutenants, not his lawyers, not the 20 men who'd sworn their lives to him in a dimly lit basement 15 years ago when he was nothing but a hungry kid with cold eyes and a faster temper. Not one of them shed a single tear when the news came through that the boss had taken 3 bullets that he'd survived by a margin so thin it was practically an insult to fate, and that the damage to his spine had left him paralyzed from the waist down. They didn't cry because men like Dominic Corsetti didn't inspire grief. They inspired obedience, fear, calculation. When a man like that falls, you don't weep. You calculate what his fall means for you. His second in command, Marco Vitelli, had said it plainly to the assembled men within 48 hours. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. The boss is recovering. Until further notice, operations continue as planned. Anyone who thinks this changes anything. Marco had paused, letting the silence do what words couldn't. He is welcome to bring that thought to me directly. Nobody brought that thought to him directly. And Dominic, lying flat on his back in the master bedroom of his estate, heard everything. Every whisper that floated through the halls, every hushed phone call that ended too quickly when someone realized the door was cracked. His ears had always been sharp. Paralysis hadn't touched that. What it had touched was everything else. 3 weeks after the shooting, the house ran like a machine without a soul. Staff moved on schedules. Security rotated in shifts. Doctors came and went with the same expressionless efficiency of men servicing expensive equipment. Nobody spoke to him unless spoken to. Nobody lingered. Nobody asked how he was feeling, partly because they were afraid of the answer, and partly because they suspected he didn't have one. They were almost right. Dominic had built his entire life on the principle that feelings were a liability. You cut them out early, the way a surgeon removes infected tissue, not because it doesn't hurt, but because leaving it will kill you faster. He'd cut out tenderness at 17 after watching his father weep over an empty bottle instead of feeding his family. He'd cut out trust at 22 after his closest friend sold his name to a rival for a price Dominic never bothered to learn because the number didn't matter. He'd cut out love, or whatever version of it he'd allowed himself at 31, when Elena left without a note, without a goodbye, and the only thing she took was the last soft corner he'd kept locked away. After that, there was nothing left to cut, or so he believed. Her name was Isabella Reyes, and she had worked in his household for 2 years. He barely remembered hiring her. He barely remembered most of the staff. They were fixtures to him, reliable, invisible, interchangeable. He paid well-demanded excellence and asked no questions about their lives because their lives were none of his concern. Isabella was quiet. That was what he knew of her. Quiet and efficient, and somehow always in the right place before he needed her to be. She never flinched when he raised his voice, never apologized when she hadn't done anything wrong. She moved through his house with a kind of calm steadiness that if he had ever paused long enough to observe, it might have struck him as unusual. He had never paused long enough to observe it, until now. The first time he actually noticed her, truly noticed her, was on a Tuesday morning 17 days into his recovery. He was in the middle of what he'd started privately calling the humiliation routine. The physical therapist, a stocky man named Gerald, came every morning at 9 to run him through a series of exercises designed to maintain upper body strength and eventually begin the long process of attempting to restore some function to his lower limbs. Dominic hated every second of it, not the pain he'd made peace with pain years ago. What he hated was the exposure, the helplessness, the way Gerald would position his legs with the careful impersonal efficiency of a man handling something fragile, and Dominic would lie there, unable to command his own body to respond, watching himself be arranged like furniture. That morning, Gerald was running late, and Dominic, who had already been awake since 4, who had already spent hours staring at the ceiling, cataloging everything he'd lost and calculating every way he might reclaim, it was in a darkness so complete it had weight. Isabella came in to leave his morning coffee on the nightstand. She didn't say good morning. She never wasted pleasantries. But as she turned to leave, she stopped. She looked at him, not at the man in the bed, not at the boss, not at the paralyzed crime lord that people whispered about. She looked at him the way you look at a person when you actually see one. Your jaw is clenched again, she said quietly. He stared at her. You've been clenching it every morning, she continued, completely calm. You're going to crack a molar. The silence stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable. Under any other circumstance, a member of his staff delivering unsolicited observations about his face would have ended their employment in under a minute. Get out, he said. His voice was flat, final. She nodded once, picked up the empty glass from the previous evening, and walked out without another word. He unclenched his jaw. He did it without thinking. And then he was furious at her, at himself, at the fact that it had worked. That night, he told Marco to find him a new maid. Marco sitting across from him with the careful posture of a man who understood exactly how much latitude he had and took none of it, nodded slowly. Any particular reason? I don't need a reason. Of course, a pause. Should I tell her tonight or tomorrow? Dominic turned his head toward the window. In the morning. Marco left. The house went quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Dominic didn't sleep. At 2 a.m, he heard the door open. Soft footsteps, the familiar unhurried rhythm of someone who knew this room well enough to move through it in the dark without disturbing anything. Isabella. She didn't turn on a light. She moved to the small table near the window, set something down. He heard the soft clink of ceramic, and then instead of leaving, she sat in the chair beside his bed, the one the doctors always used, the one Marco occasionally occupied when they needed to discuss business that couldn't wait. What are you doing? His voice came out sharper than he intended. I couldn't sleep, she said simply. That isn't my problem. No, she agreed. It isn't. She didn't leave. He could have called security. He could have shouted for the night staff. He could have ended this strange, inexplicable moment in a dozen different ways that were entirely within his power. He didn't. You're being let go tomorrow, he said instead. He said it the way he delivered all bad news, directly, without softening, because softening was for people who felt guilty about their decisions. She was quiet for a moment. I know. He turned his head to look at her. In the thin light coming through the curtains, he could see the outline of her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, the absolute lack of panic or pleading on her face. Marco told you. Marco didn't have to? Her voice was even. You've been looking for reasons since Monday. Something shifted in his chest. He ignored it. Then why are you still here? She looked at him then directly without flinching, the way very few people in his life had ever dared. Because you haven't slept in 4 nights. And because whatever is eating at you at 2 a.m, Dominic Corsetti, she said his name without any of the usual reverence, as if it were just a name and not a warning, is going to swallow you whole if you keep fighting it alone. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. You're fired, he said. I heard you the first time, she replied, and she didn't move. He didn't call for security. He told himself it was because the effort wasn't worth it, because she was leaving in the morning anyway, because there were bigger battles to fight than one woman sitting in a chair at 2 a.m. He told himself a lot of things. He was still telling himself those things when exhaustion finally pulled him under somewhere around 4 a.m, and he slept. Truly slept, without the brittle half-consciousness that had been passing for rest since the shooting for the first time in weeks. He woke up at 7, and she was asleep beside him. Not in the bed, she was still in the chair, but she'd leaned forward at some point in the night, her head resting on her folded arms on the edge of the mattress, her hand stretched out across the blanket, her fingers loosely curled around his. He stared at their hands, his scarred, thick-knuckled, a hand that had done things he'd stopped counting long ago, hers smaller, the knuckles slightly rough from work, the nails trimmed short and unpainted. He didn't pull away. He didn't understand why he didn't pull away. He cataloged every rational reason to do it. She was an employee. She was awake. She was crossing a line that didn't need to be crossed. He was Dominic Corsetti, and no one touched him without permission. And then he stopped cataloging. because something was happening that he couldn't logic his way out of. Something in his chest, in the part of him he thought he'd cauterized years ago, was moving. Not breaking it wasn't dramatic enough for breaking. It was more like a door that had been sealed shut for so long that even the hinges had forgotten their purpose, and someone had just pressed a hand against it from the other side. Warm, quiet, without force, just present. He lay there for 23 minutes before she stirred. He counted. When Isabella opened her eyes, she went still for exactly 1 second. The only second in which he saw something close to surprise on her face, and then she straightened up slowly and rolling her neck, pressing her lips together against what he suspected was considerable pain from the position she'd held all night. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You slept," she said. Not a question. "You stayed," he replied, not an accusation. She looked down at their hands. He still hadn't moved his. She carefully, gently withdrew hers, not yanking, not startled, just unhooking her fingers the way you'd set down something you'd been holding carefully because it mattered. She stood, smoothed her uniform. "I'll get your coffee." "Isabella." She stopped. He didn't know what he'd intended to say. He was not a man who said things he didn't know the end of. Every sentence he'd ever spoken had been calculated before it left his mouth. He did not leave himself open. He did not reach toward things without knowing exactly what he would do when he reached them. "Don't," he stopped, started again. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Don't go to Marco this morning." She turned. The expression on her face was careful and unreadable, and somehow behind all of that slightly devastated, which was strange because she wasn't the one who'd been fired. "Dominic." "I'm not rescinding it," he said quickly, because he wasn't. He was Dominic Corsetti, and he did not walk back his decisions. Another stop, another reaching towards something he couldn't name. "I need to know something first." She waited. "Why did you stay last night after I told you to go?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Long enough that the silence began to fill in with all the sounds of a house waking up, distant footsteps, the hum of the kitchen starting up, the sound of his life continuing without his permission. The way lives do. "Because," she said finally, her voice low and even and careful as a woman walking a ledge. "You looked exactly like my father did the night he realized he'd spent his whole life building walls instead of doors." She paused, and nobody stayed for him. She walked out before he could respond. He lay there in the silence she left behind, and for the first time since the shooting, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for Dominic Corsetti did not feel like the most powerful man in the room. He felt like a man, just a man, and somehow that was so much worse, and so much more terrifying. And underneath all of that, buried so deep he almost didn't recognize it, something that felt impossibly like relief. By the time Gerald arrived at 9, Dominic had made 2 decisions. The first was that Isabella Reyes was not losing her job. The second was that he was never going to acknowledge why. He held on to that second decision for exactly 4 more days. The change was gradual. That was the thing about it, it didn't announce itself. There was no single moment where Dominic decided to let his guard down, no conscious choice to allow something different into the locked-down architecture of his daily existence. It happened the way water moves through stone, slowly, consistently, without drama. Isabella came back the morning after their exchange as if nothing had happened. She brought his coffee. She exchanged 3 words with Gerald about the positioning of the therapy mat. She checked the medication schedule that Dominic's doctor had left, noticed one of the afternoon doses had been incorrectly transcribed, and quietly corrected it without mentioning it to anyone. He noticed. He noticed the correction. He noticed the silence around it. He noticed the fact that she hadn't made it a point, hadn't turned it into a demonstration of her competence, hadn't used it as leverage. She just fixed it because it needed fixing the same way she fixed everything methodically, without expectation, without keeping score. He filed it away. The next morning when she brought the coffee, he said, "The dosage correction. The afternoon prescription." She glanced up. "Thank you," he said. The word came out stiff, slightly formal, like a door opening on hinges that hadn't been used in a long time. That was a mistake that could have caused complications. She looked at him for one measured beat. "I know," she said. "That's why I fixed it." "I'm saying I noticed," he said. I'm saying another stop. That reaching again. I want you to know that I see the things you do, even when I don't say so. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not what people say you are. Yes, I am, he replied immediately, flatly, without hesitation. No, she set the coffee down on the nightstand. You're what you chose to become. That's not the same thing. She left before he could dismantle that argument. He spent the next 3 hours trying to. He couldn't. The morning Marco came to give him the weekly operations report, a habit that had continued out of necessity because Dominic's empire didn't pause for spinal injuries. Isabella was in the room changing the linens on the far side of the bed. Marco entered, nodded to her with a glance that said leave, and opened his folder. Isabella didn't leave. She continued folding a corner of the sheet with the same unrushed efficiency she brought to everything. Marco looked at Dominic. Dominic said nothing. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was a man who understood silence as language, and Dominic's silence just then spoke loudly enough that Marco proceeded with the report without another look at Isabella. They went through shipment confirmations, territorial adjustments, a dispute in the Docklands that was on the edge of becoming something uglier, a meeting request from the Calderaro family that couldn't be ignored much longer. Through all of it, Dominic gave his instructions in the measured cold precision that had built his reputation. He did not hesitate. He did not show weakness. He was to all outward observation exactly what he had always been. But when Marco finished and closed the folder, he paused at the door. There's one more thing. His voice had taken on a particular flatness that Dominic recognized. It was the tone Marco used for information he didn't want to deliver. The Serrano crew has been asking questions. What kind of questions? About your condition. Marco's eyes moved briefly, almost involuntarily, toward Isabella, who was now moving toward the door with a stack of folded linens. Questions about whether the condition is permanent, Marco continued, and questions about a deliberate pause. Vulnerabilities, specifically people in the household. Dominic's gaze sharpened to a point. That's all I have, Marco said. For now, he left. The room felt different in the silence that followed, like the air itself had changed temperature. Isabella stood near the door, linens in her arms, completely still. He looked at her, she looked at him, and in her eyes, underneath the steadiness that was such a constant part of her that he'd started to think of it as structural, he saw something else. She knew what that meant. She understood exactly what Marco's careful, measured delivery had been designed to communicate, and she understood what it meant for her, and she was not going to say anything about it, because she was Isabella, because she didn't ask to be saved. Put the linens down, he said. Dominic, Isabella. His voice was quiet, absolute. Put them down. She put them down. You're not going anywhere alone, he said. Not outside this house, not anywhere in this house that isn't covered by security, starting today. She looked at him steadily. You can't protect everyone. I'm not protecting everyone, he said. I'm protecting you. The words landed between them like something physical. He hadn't planned them. He hadn't calculated their weight or considered their implications or thought through what they meant coming from him, the man who protected nothing but leverage and legacy. He just said it because it was true. And from the way Isabella's expression shifted barely the smallest tremor in a face built for stillness, she understood exactly how much that cost him. She nodded once. All right, she said softly. And Dominic Corsetti, paralyzed, diminished, stripped of everything he'd built his identity on, turned his face back toward the window and felt somewhere beneath the fear and the fury and the cold discipline of a lifetime a single terrifying ember of something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He had no name for it yet, but it was warm and it did not go out. The ember didn't go out. That was the problem. Dominic had expected it to. He'd expected to wake up the next morning with the cold clarity he'd always relied on, the kind of clarity that came from a lifetime of keeping emotion exactly where it belonged, which was nowhere near anything that mattered. He'd expected the previous night to feel like a temporary malfunction, a side effect of the injury, the isolation, the particular vulnerability of being a man who could not stand up in his own house. He woke up at 5 a.m, and the first thing he thought about was the way she'd said, all right, not as surrender, not as compliance, but as a decision, as if she'd weighed something and found it worth accepting. He was in serious trouble and he knew it. What he didn't know, couldn't have known yet, was that trouble in this house was already wearing a different face entirely. Marco came back that afternoon without an appointment. That itself was a signal. Marco didn't move without choreography. Every visit, every call, every carefully worded update was timed and deliberate. Unannounced was not in his vocabulary. He closed the door behind him, didn't sit. "We have a problem," he said. Dominic looked at him. "You're going to need to narrow that down. The Serrano crew isn't asking questions anymore." Marco's voice was stripped of everything except the facts. "They're making statements. Word came through Benedetti's people an hour ago. Serrano is calling a meeting with the other families. This week." The air went thin. "On whose authority?" Dominic's voice was absolutely level. The colder he got, the quieter he got. That was something every person in his world had learned to read as the last warning before a storm. "That's the thing." Marco set a phone on the bed beside him. On the screen was a photograph, a meeting table, 4 men, none of them Serrano. "It's not Serrano calling the meeting. Serrano is the excuse. Someone else is moving the pieces." Dominic looked at the photograph for a long time. He recognized 2 of the 4 men immediately. The third took him a moment. The fourth, "That's Gallo," he said. "Yes." Carlo Gallo, who had sat across from Dominic at his own table 6 months ago, who had shaken his hand and called him brother and sworn on the names of people who should have made that oath mean something. "When did this start?" Dominic asked. "Based on what Benedetti's man is telling us," Marco paused. "Within days of the shooting. The silence that followed had texture. It had weight." "He knew," Dominic said. "He may have been informed," Marco said carefully, "or he may have—" "He knew, Marco." Dominic's jaw set. "The shooting wasn't random. We both knew that from the beginning. I just didn't think the hand behind it was someone who'd been inside this house." Marco didn't argue, because Marco had suspected the same thing and had been waiting for Dominic to arrive at it himself. "I need names," Dominic said. "I need every connection between Gallo and the Serrano crew going back 2 years. I need to know who else was in that room that we're not seeing in that photograph. And I need it before that meeting happens." "There's one more thing," Marco said. The tone again, the one for information he didn't want to deliver. He glanced at the door. Dominic went still. "Say it." "Gallo's been asking specific questions about the household." "Specifically." Marco stopped, looked at him with the expression of a man deciding how much truth the room could hold. "About a woman, 30s, dark hair, goes by the name Reyes." The ember in Dominic's chest went from warm to white hot in under a second. "He's been asking about Isabella," he said. "Not a question. He's been asking how long she's been employed here, whether she has family in the city, whether she—" "Stop!" Dominic's voice came out flat and absolute and razor thin. "Get security on her, now. Not in an hour, right now, and nobody moves her anywhere without my direct order. Are we clear, Crystal?" Marco said. He moved for the door, then paused. He turned back with the expression he wore when he was about to say something that sat on the wrong side of his loyalty. "Dominic, I need to ask you something." "Then ask it." "How much does she know about your operation?" The question landed like a slap. Not because it was aggressive. Marco wasn't built for aggression. He was built for precision, but because of what it implied. The assessment it contained. The gentle, careful suggestion threaded between the words. "She's a maid, Marco." "She's been in this house for 2 years," Marco replied evenly. "She's been in your room every day for the past 3 weeks. She's been present for more conversations than I'm entirely comfortable with. I'm not making an accusation. I'm identifying a risk." "She's not a risk." The conviction in Dominic's voice surprised them both. Marco nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when he was cataloging something he intended to return to. "Understood," he said, and left. Dominic stared at the ceiling. Isabella wasn't a risk. He knew that the way he knew very few things, not through evidence, not through calculation, but through something older and more honest than either of those things. Something he'd suppressed so long he barely had a name for it anymore. Instinct, the human kind, the kind that didn't come from reading rooms or measuring threats, the kind that came from actually seeing a person. He'd seen her, finally fully after 2 years of her being invisible by design, his design, the design of a man who turned people into functions. He had seen Isabella Reyes. And what he'd seen was not a threat, was not a plant, not a spy, not a piece on someone else's board. What he'd seen was a woman who stayed when she had every reason to go and asked for nothing in return. That was either the most dangerous thing in the world or the most rare. He was no longer sure there was a difference. She came in 20 minutes later. He could tell by the way she moved that she'd already heard. Security had found her in the east hallway. He'd find out later that a man named Torres had intercepted her with an earpiece still in eyes scanning, hand too close to his side, and she'd understood immediately what the shift in atmosphere meant. She'd asked no questions. She'd come straight to him. "You heard," he said. "Torres isn't subtle," she replied. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question with the same unhurried honesty she brought to everything. "I've been frightened before," she said. "This isn't the worst version of it." "What was the worst version?" She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, a door of her own opening slightly, and then deciding against it. "That's a long story," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. And then with a dry edge that surprised even him, literally, the corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. Not quite, but the first thing in that neighborhood he'd seen from her in 3 weeks. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair. The chair, his doctor's chair, Marco's chair, and now with a certainty that had settled quietly into the architecture of his days, her chair. "I need you to tell me something," he said. "All right, and I need the truth, not the version you think is safest, not the version that keeps things uncomplicated, the actual truth." She didn't look away. "I'll do my best." "How did you end up here?" He watched her face. "In this house with me. 2 years ago, what was the actual reason?" The pause that followed was the longest she'd given him yet. She folded her hands in her lap, unfolded them, looked at the window, and then back at him. "The agency placed me," she said carefully. "I know what the paperwork says." Another pause. "My brother," she said. Her voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something compressed, something held in by the long practice of a person who had learned that releasing it in the wrong moment cost too much. "My brother was in debt, significant debt, to people connected to this world." She stopped. "Someone I was never told who arranged for my placement here as part of a settlement. I was told it was safe. I was told it was straightforward domestic work and that after 2 years the debt would be considered cleared." Dominic didn't move, didn't speak. He let the information land exactly where it needed to land and stayed very still while it did. "Who arranged it?" he asked. "I was told it came through a man named DeLuca." "DeLuca works for Gallo." She looked at him steadily. "I know that now." The air in the room had completely changed. He felt it, the specific cold of a picture reorganizing itself the moment when pieces that seemed unrelated that suddenly reveal their arrangement. "You knew," he said slowly. "When Marco mentioned Gallo's name this morning, you already knew the connection." "I knew a connection existed," she said. Her voice was careful and honest and slightly raw. "I didn't know the full shape of it. I still don't." She looked at him directly, not defensive, not pleading, just unflinchingly present. "I came here to work off my brother's debt. That was the whole of it. Whatever else this is," she stopped. "Whatever this has become, that wasn't the plan. That wasn't anyone's plan." He believed her. He hated how completely and immediately he believed her, because it removed the one interpretation of this situation that would have made it simple. If she'd been sent here deliberately, if she was Gallo's instrument, then the warmth he'd felt, the crack in the careful architecture of his chest and all of it, would have had a clean, brutal explanation. It would have been manipulation. It would have been a weapon dressed in kindness, and he would have known exactly how to respond to that. But she wasn't. She was a woman who had been used without her full knowledge. The same way dozens of people in his world got used, placed in positions shaped by someone else's chess game, never told the full board. "Your brother," he said. "Where is he now?" "Alive," she said. "That's about all I can confirm." "Is he in the city?" "I don't know." The rawness in her voice broke the surface just barely, like a stone shifting underwater. "We haven't spoken in 8 months. He went quiet after the debt was settled. I've been trying not to need to know." "That means you're terrified," Dominic said quietly. "That means you stopped asking because the answer felt too dangerous to hear." She looked at him. He looked back, and the silence between them was something entirely different from the silence of the previous weeks, not the careful distance of employer and employee, not even the fragile new warmth of two people discovering each other across an impossible gap. This was the silence of two people who had just without planning it placed something true on the table between them, something that couldn't be taken back. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "But you didn't, and I understand why, and it doesn't change anything I've already decided." She frowned slightly. "What have you already decided?" He met her gaze. "That you're not leaving this house until I know exactly what Gallo wants with you, exactly how far his reach goes, and exactly how to make sure he understands that you are—" He paused. The word that came next wasn't a calculated choice. It arrived the way the truth does when you've stopped trying to manage it. "Off limits." The word hung between them. Isabella didn't respond immediately. She looked at him with the expression of someone counting something invisible, the cost of a feeling maybe, or the weight of trusting a man whose hands had done the kind of things his had done. "Dominic, don't argue with me right now," he said. "I'm allowed one thing that isn't strategy." She was quiet for a long moment. "One thing," she said softly. "One thing." She nodded, and this time it wasn't the nod of compliance. It was the nod of someone who had just carefully decided to trust something they couldn't entirely justify. He filed that away too, in a different place than the other things he filed, in a place that had been empty for a very long time. That evening, two things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Marco returned with a full dossier on Carlo Gallo's movements over the past 6 months, and what it revealed was worse than Dominic had anticipated. Gallo hadn't just been maneuvering since the shooting, he'd been building for over a year. The shooting wasn't opportunism, it was the conclusion of a patient, carefully constructed plan, which meant someone inside Dominic's organization, someone close enough to know, schedules routes the specific night in question, had been feeding Gallo information for months. The second thing was a phone call. It came through on the secure line that only 8 people in the world had the number for. Dominic answered it himself because the alternative was letting Marco answer it and losing whatever intelligence came with the voice on the other end. The voice that answered was one he hadn't heard in over 3 years. "Hello, Dominic." Smooth, unhurried. The voice of a man who had calculated exactly how much time to let pass before making this call. "I heard you were having a difficult season." "Carlo," Dominic said. He said it the same way he said every name, with the same flat, controlled delivery he'd spent 30 years perfecting. Nothing in his voice gave away what was happening in his chest. The cold fury, yes, but beneath it, threaded through it like wire through concrete, the awareness of Isabella in the next room, and the specific visceral fear of a man who had just realized that the one person capable of cracking him open was exactly the pressure point his enemy had already identified. "I thought we should talk," Gallo said, "before things get messy." "Things are already messy, Carlo." "They don't have to stay that way." A pause measured theatrical, the pause of a man who enjoyed delivering the next line. "I just need one thing from you, something small, something that, given your current situation, you might find surprisingly easy to give." Dominic waited. "The girl," Gallo said. "Send her to me. We'll call everything else settled." The world went very quiet. "Which girl?" Dominic said. His voice was still flat, still cold. Still the voice of Dominic Corsetti, who did not react, who did not reveal, who did not give his enemy the satisfaction of seeing what a sentence could do to him. "Don't insult me," Gallo said. "We both know there's only one." Dominic held the phone for 3 seconds. Then he said in the quietest voice he had ever used in his life, quieter than anger, quieter than threat, the voice that lived on the other side of both. "If you touch her, Carlo, if you send one person within a mile of her, I will burn everything you've built. Not from this bed, not from this room. I will get up, I will find a way, and I will come for you myself." The silence on the other end lasted a long time. Then Gallo said almost thoughtfully, "That's very interesting, Dominic," and hung up. Dominic set the phone down. He stared at his own hands, those scarred, thick-knuckled hands that had built an empire on fear, and felt them shaking. Not from weakness, from the particular terror of realizing with absolute certainty that he had just told his most dangerous enemy exactly where to find the one thing that could destroy him. He had just told Carlo Gallo that Isabella Reyes was everything. and he hadn't been able to stop himself. Because she was. The shaking stopped within a minute. Dominic had trained himself for that. The body's betrayals were temporary if you refused to feed them. You breathe through it. You anchor yourself in the next decision. You do not sit in what just happened. You move to what happens next. But the knowing didn't stop. That stayed. That settled into him like something permanent, like a fact that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the right moment to introduce itself. Isabella Reyes mattered to him, not as a liability, not as a complication, as a person. As the specific, irreplaceable person who had stayed in a chair all night and held his hand without being asked and told him the truth about his own face when no one else in his life had the courage to say anything at all. He told Gallo exactly that. Not in words and tone, in that one moment of quiet fury that had slipped past 30 years of discipline like water through a crack, which meant he had approximately 48 hours before Gallo moved. He picked up the phone again and called Marco. Marco answered on the first ring. "I heard," he said, because Marco always heard. "I was in the hall." "Then you know what we're working with. I know you just told Gallo where your pressure point is." A pause. "I also know you couldn't have done otherwise. Not and lived with it." Dominic went still. That was not a sentence Marco Vitelli had ever come close to saying to him in 15 years. Marco dealt in operations and outcomes, not in the interior lives of the men he served. "Don't do that," Dominic said. "Do what?" "Understand me. I don't need that from you right now. I need solutions." "All right, back to business. Back to the language they both trusted. I've already doubled the exterior detail. I'm pulling Torres and Reyna off rotation and putting them exclusively on the house interior. Nobody comes through the front gate without my personal clearance. That buys us time. It doesn't solve the problem." "No," Marco agreed. "Solving the problem means finding out who Gallo has inside. Because Gallo knowing about Isabella, that's not public information. That came from someone in this building." The sentence dropped into Dominic's chest and detonated quietly. Someone in this building, someone who had watched him for the past 3 weeks, who had seen the shift, recognized what it meant and reported back. "Pull the staff records," Dominic said. "Everyone who's had access to my room in the last 20 days. Cross-reference with any financial activity, any unexplained absences, any contact with numbers we don't recognize." "Already started," Marco said. "There's one name that's standing out. Hu Hao Chen, the night orderly. He called an unlisted number twice in the last week. Both calls were under 4 minutes. Both were placed between 2 and 3 in the morning. 2 and 3 in the morning, when the house was quiet, when Isabella had been in his room. "Pick him up," Dominic said. "Tonight, quietly." "Done." Another pause. "Dominic, there's something else I pulled from the Gallo dossier that I didn't mention earlier. I needed to verify it first." "Verify it." "The debt," Marco said carefully. "Isabella's brother, the arrangement that brought her here. I traced it back further than DeLuca." He stopped. "It goes back to you." Dominic went absolutely still. "What are you saying?" 2 years ago, there was a debt settlement processed through the Benedetti account. A man named Rafael Reyes, owed a significant amount to a loan operation that fell under your umbrella. The settlement was flagged because it was cleared at zero debt, forgiven entirely. Someone in your organization signed off on it. Marco's voice was careful, deliberate, each word placed like a step on uncertain ground. "The signature is yours." The silence lasted a long time. "I never signed that," Dominic said. "I know," Marco replied. "That's what concerns me." Someone had used Dominic's signature, his authority, his name to manufacture the debt arrangement that brought Isabella into his house. Someone had constructed the entire situation. Not Gallo, not recently. 2 years ago, long before the shooting, someone had placed Isabella Reyes in Dominic Corsetti's home with the patience of a person who understood that the most dangerous weapons are the ones that arrive slowly. The question burning through him, now the one he needed answered before anything else, was whether Isabella knew that. He told himself he already knew the answer. He told himself that 3 times before he believed it. She knocked on his door at 9 that evening. He recognized her knock by now, 3 soft, evenly spaced taps, unhurried. She came in without waiting for a response because She knew he'd say come in the way she knew most things about him that he'd never consciously demonstrated. You haven't eaten, she said. She set a covered plate on the nightstand with the matter-of-fact efficiency that was her default language. Then she looked at him, and her default language changed. What happened? Sit down, he said. She sat. She read his face the way she always did, not quickly, not anxiously, but with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that what a person doesn't say is almost always more important than what they do. You found something, she said. Marco found something. He looked at her steadily. About your brother's debt, about the arrangement that brought you here. Her hands folded in her lap. He watched that happen, watched the preparation in it, the bracing. The debt was cleared under my signature, he said, 2 years ago, from an account in my name. She stared at him. I didn't sign it, he said immediately. Someone used my authority without my knowledge. Someone manufactured the arrangement, which means Isabella. He stopped, held her gaze. Someone planned for you to be here, long before the shooting, long before any of this. The color didn't drain from her face. It did something more complicated than that. It rearranged. The steadiness didn't crack, but it shifted, and beneath it he could see the rapid, brutal process of a person recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last 2 years of their life. Raphael, she said. Her brother's name came out like something being lifted from somewhere deep. Is he? I don't know yet, Dominic said. Marco's working on it. Is he alive? I don't know. He said it plainly because she deserved plain, but I'm going to find out, tonight. She nodded, she pressed her lips together. She looked at a fixed point on the wall and breathed through something he could see the work of it, the invisible labor of staying composed, when the ground had just shifted under you, and then she looked back at him. I wasn't sent here to spy on you, she said. Her voice was low and even and direct. I need you to believe that. I do, he said. I wasn't. She stopped. Something behind her eyes fractured slightly just at the edges. I would never have Isabella. His voice was quiet, not soft quiet. There was a difference and she heard it. I know. Stop. She stopped. They sat in the particular silence of two people who have just survived something together without moving an inch. Someone used you, he said, the same way people in this world use everyone. They found the thing you loved most and they made it a lever. He paused. Your brother. He's all I have left, she said, barely above a whisper. I know, Dominic said. And for a moment, just a moment, one unguarded second, the thing in his chest that had been growing since the night he woke up with her hand in his is pressed against the inside of his ribs, hard enough to feel like pain. I'm going to find him. That's not a promise I make lightly. She looked at him for a long time. Then, you've never made a promise to me before. No, he said, I haven't. She understood what he wasn't saying. She received it the way she received everything, without performance, without drama, straight into the part of herself that knew what to do with it. Don't make it harder than it needs to be, she said gently. Too late, he replied. And for the first time since he'd woken up in this bed, a broken man. The first actual, complete, unperformed smile crossed Dominic Corsetti's face. It lasted about 4 seconds before Marco walked in. The expression on Marco's face when he entered was one Dominic had seen perhaps 3 times in 15 years. It was the expression Marco wore when information arrived that changed the shape of everything. He looked briefly at Isabella, then at Dominic. Chen confessed, he said. It took 11 minutes. Dominic said nothing, waited. He's been on Gallo's payroll for 8 months. His job was simple report on your condition, your movements, your visitors, your emotional state. Marco paused on the last 2 words, clearly conscious of what they meant in this room, with this woman sitting 3 feet from the bed. He also confirmed that Gallo has someone else, someone higher. How high? Marco's jaw tightened. He doesn't know the name. But based on the information that persons have been passing, it has to be someone with direct access to your operational decisions. Another pause. Someone who knew about the Benedetti account 2 years ago. The room went very still. Dominic ran the list in his mind. The Benedetti account was not common knowledge. It was a specific layered financial instrument that maybe 6 people in his organization knew existed. He went through all 6 names in under 30 seconds. 5 of them he could dismiss with relative confidence. The sixth name sat in his mind like a stone in still water and sent everything rippling. He didn't say it out loud, not yet, not until he was certain. "Thank you," he said to Marco. "Get Chen secured and get me everything he has on the communication method he used. Frequency, timing, drop protocol, all of it." Marco nodded and left. Isabella hadn't moved. She was watching him with the focused, careful attention of a woman who understood that she'd just been present for something significant and wasn't sure yet whether to address it. "You know who it is," she said. He looked at her. "The person higher up," she said. "You went somewhere just now. You found it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I have a strong suspicion." "Is it someone you trusted?" "It's someone I trusted more than anyone," he said. The weight of it was enormous, and he refused to put it down in front of her because it wasn't her weight to carry. "Which means I need to be very careful about what I do next. Because if I'm wrong, I lose an ally I can't replace. And if I'm right, you lose something worse than an ally," she said softly. He looked at her. Yes. She didn't push. She didn't ask. She sat with the knowledge the way she sat with everything, completely without trying to make it smaller than it was. "My father used to say," she said quietly, "that the most painful truths are the ones we already knew. We just needed time to catch up to what we felt." He held that for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was a difficult man to argue with," he said. "Impossible," she said. The word came out warm and sad at the same time, the particular combination that belongs to people we've lost. He was right about almost everything and terrible at almost everything else. What was he terrible at? She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. "Staying," she said. "He was terrible at staying." Dominic heard the full weight of that. Not just the fact of her father leaving, but the shape it had cut into her. The particular way a person who's been left learns to stay themselves, learns to hold on, learns to sit in a chair all night beside a man who told her to go, because somewhere in her history, staying became the only form of love she fully trusted. He understood that. From a different direction, through a completely different wreckage, he understood it completely. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, a deliberate echo of what she'd said to him weeks ago when he'd told her he had nowhere to go. Literally. She laughed. It was quiet and brief and real, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years, and he was going to carry it with him into whatever came next, like a man carries a light into a dark place. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. An unlisted number. He glanced at Isabella. She read his face and stood immediately, moving toward the door. "Stay," he said. He said it before he had thought it through. She turned. "Stay in the room," he said, more measured now. "I need you where I can see you," when she came back. She stood near the window, far enough to be out of the conversation, close enough that he could see her, which was apparently the requirement his chest had set without consulting the rest of him. He answered the call. The voice on the other end was not Gallo. It was Marco. But the Marco on the phone sounded like a fundamentally different man than the Marco who had just walked out of the room 2 minutes ago. His voice was clipped, stripped of everything except urgency. "You need to hear this now," Marco said. "I just got a call from Benedetti's man." Gallo moved up the timeline. "The meeting with the families is tonight. It already started." "What?" Dominic's voice was a blade. "It started 20 minutes ago. And Dominic," a pause that lasted less than a second but contained everything. "They're not just meeting about the territory. Benedetti's man says Gallo brought something to the table. Leverage. Something he said would guarantee no one moves against him once you're gone." "What leverage?" "A recording," Marco said, "audio of a phone call made from this house in the last 48 hours. The bottom fell out of the room. The phone call. His call with Gallo. "If you touch her, Carlo, I will get up. I will come for you myself." The voice of Dominic Corsetti, the man who ruled through the image of absolute cold control, recorded and delivered to every rival family as evidence that the great Dominic Corsetti had cracked open. That he had a weakness. That the weakness had a name and a face and was standing right now near his window. Every family would hear that recording. Every family would understand exactly what it meant. And every one of them would make the same calculation that a man defined by his vulnerability was a man who could be broken through it. "The house is tapped," Dominic said. His voice was absolutely flat. Has been for at least 2 weeks based on what Chen is telling us, Marco confirmed. Dominic, I need your instructions. Right now. He looked at Isabella. She was watching him. She had heard enough, not the words, but the shift in the air, the specific quality of a man absorbing a catastrophic blow and deciding in real time how to respond to it. She was watching him with those steady, clear eyes, and she wasn't frightened, and she wasn't running, and she wasn't asking him to protect her. She was just looking at him, like she was saying, I see you. Whatever comes next, I see you. And Dominic Corsetti, who had spent 30 years building a world out of fear, who had walled himself off from every soft thing who had fired her and rehired her and kept her at a distance, he'd already failed to maintain. Dominic Corsetti made a decision. Not a strategic one, not a calculated one, a human one. Marco, he said into the phone. His voice was cold and certain, and underneath both those things something new, something that sounded almost like clarity. Get me Benedetti directly. Not his man, him. Tell him I want 5 minutes before that meeting ends. Tell him I have something Gallo doesn't know I have. What do you have? Marco asked. Dominic looked at Isabella. The truth, he said, about who arranged my shooting, and evidence that Gallo's been running a play against every family at this table, not just mine. He paused, including Benedetti's. A long silence. That's either going to work perfectly, Marco said slowly, or it's going to be the last call you ever make. I know, Dominic said. Make it anyway. He hung up. Isabella crossed the room. She stopped beside the bed, not the chair beside the bed, and she looked at him with an expression that held everything she hadn't said in 3 weeks, every version of care she translated into coffee and corrected prescriptions and nights spent in that chair. Whatever you're about to do, she said quietly, you don't have to do it alone. He looked up at her. I know, he said, and he meant it in every possible direction. Then the lights in the house went out, every single one, simultaneously. The security panel on the wall went dark. The monitors died. The steady electronic hum that underscored every moment of every day in a house built on surveillance gone. Complete silence. Complete darkness. And from somewhere below them on the ground floor of the house came a sound that Dominic recognized from 100 different nights in 100 different places. The sound of a door being forced open. They were already inside. The darkness lasted 4 seconds before Dominic's training took over completely. Get down, he said. His voice was low, controlled, stripped of everything except command. Floor, now. Dominic. Isabella, floor. She dropped without another word. He heard her move, the soft sound of her palms hitting the ground, the controlled exhale of someone pushing fear aside to make room for function. He reached for the side table, the drawer he'd asked Torres to stock 3 days ago when the threat level shifted. His hand found the gun immediately. The weight of it settled into his grip like something remembered by muscle, not mind. He couldn't stand. He couldn't run. He couldn't put himself between her and the door the way every instinct demanded. And for one single searing second, the helplessness of that slammed into him harder than the bullets had. Then he moved past it, because he had no other option, and because Dominic Corsetti had survived 30 years in this world by understanding one fundamental truth: you work with what you have not, with what you wish you had. Move toward the bathroom, he said quietly. Stay low, stay against the wall. What about you, Entrito? I'm fine where I am. You're in the middle of the room in a bed that can't be moved, and you have one gun. Her voice was low, but it had an edge to it. Not panic, something sharper than panic. The focused intensity of a person whose mind had shifted into a gear he hadn't seen before. Isabella. Stop telling me to hide. She appeared beside him in the dark. He could feel her presence more than see her, and something pressed into his left hand. Cold, flat, hard. A phone, not his, hers. Torres gave me a secondary number, she said, 3 days ago when you told him to put security on me. He said if anything happened to the main lines, use this. He stared at her in the darkness for a beat that lasted longer than it should have. You held on to that, he said. I was hoping I wouldn't need it, she replied. I was wrong. He took the phone, dialed Torres. Torres answered in 2 rings. His voice was already in motion, clipped fast, the particular compression of a professional managing an active situation. We have 4 on the ground floor. 2 came through the service entrance, 2 through the east wing. They cut the main panel from outside professional job, not improvised. How many of ours are between them and the second floor? 2. Raina's pinned near the kitchen corridor. I'm on the stairs. A sound in the background, sharp, brief, unmistakable. Make that one. Torres, I'm fine, grazed, keep moving. Another sound. Boss, they're not trying to be subtle anymore. This isn't a snatch job, these are cleanup men. Cleanup, not retrieve, not capture, eliminate. Gallo had decided that leverage wasn't enough anymore. The recording, the meeting, the political positioning, all of it was prelude. The real message was being delivered right now in the dark by 4 men moving through his house. How long before backup arrives? Dominic asked. Marco's 7 minutes out with 6 men. 7 minutes. He ran the math in under 3 seconds. 4 intruders, 1 operational guard on the stairs, 1 pinned, and 7 minutes between this room and the cavalry. 7 minutes was a very long time. All right, he said. He handed the phone back to Isabella. Stay connected with Torres. Tell me everything he tells you. And you, she asked. I'm going to make a phone call of my own. He dialed a number he knew by heart, a number he hadn't used in over a year, a number that belonged to a man who occupied the 6th slot on the list Marco had handed him, the list of people with access to the Benedetti account. The name that had dropped into his mind like a stone and sent everything rippling. The phone rang 3 times, then Dominic. The voice was careful, not surprised, careful. The distinction was enormous. Vincent, Dominic said. Vincent Moreau, his oldest ally. The man who had been at his right hand since before Marco, since before the organization had a name, since 2 hungry boys from the same neighborhood had decided that the world owed them something and set out to collect. 32 years, the length of some people's entire lives. I know why you're calling, Vincent said. Then skip the part where you explain yourself, Dominic said. There are men in my house, right now, Gallo's men, and you and I both know you're the only person who could have gotten him the access codes to my security panel. The silence on the other end was the silence of a man who had been waiting for this call, the way a person waits for a verdict they already know is coming. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Vincent said. His voice had changed. The carefulness had cracked, and what was underneath it was something Dominic recognized, not guilt exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a man who made a bad decision and has been living inside its consequences ever since. No, Dominic said quietly. It never is. He told me it was just about territory, that all he needed was information that you'd step back voluntarily once you understood the political situation had shifted. He was going to kill me, Vincent. Dominic's voice stayed level. He would not give himself the luxury of fury, not now. He was always where he's going to kill me, and you knew that. A long pause. I knew it about 6 months ago, Vincent said, barely above a whisper, when I couldn't get out anymore. Get out now, Dominic said. Right now, tonight. Call Gallo's man at the Benedetti meeting and tell them you want confirmation that the job here has been called off. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but get me my 7 minutes, Vincent. Silence. Vincent. Why? The word came out rough, cracked, the voice of a man who had done something unforgivable and couldn't understand why the person he wronged was offering him anything. Why would you? Because Dominic said, and the next sentence cost him more than he would ever admit out loud. You were my brother before you were my enemy, and I don't have enough of those left to waste one. The silence stretched, and then something happened that Dominic hadn't fully calculated as a possibility. Vincent Moreau, 61 years old, 32 years of shared history, the man who had put a knife in his back with the particular careful slowness of someone who told himself it wasn't really a knife, Vincent Moreau started crying. Not loudly, not with drama, just a quiet broken sound that traveled through the phone like a thread unraveling, and Dominic listened to it because Vincent had earned the right to that much at least. I'll make the call, Vincent said. He hung up. Dominic lowered the phone. Isabella was beside him. She had heard enough, not the words, but the shape of the conversation, the weight of what had just passed through it. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully catalog. Something layered and complicated and real. Torres says they've stopped moving, she said quietly. The 2 on the east wing have gone still. He doesn't know why. They're waiting for a call, Dominic said. A confirmation call that isn't going to come. She understood. She nodded slowly. Then that was someone you loved. Not a question. He didn't treat it like one. Yes, he said. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't fill the space with anything soft or platitudinal. She just stayed present with the truth of it, the way she stayed with everything, and he was more grateful for that silence than he knew how to express. 2 minutes later, Torres confirmed it. The two men in the East Wing were withdrawing. He could hear it on the line, the specific quiet of men standing down. The two near the kitchen went still, then reversed. The house had stopped contracting around them. Vincent had made the call. 4 minutes after that, Marco arrived with 6 men and the lights came back on. The first thing Marco did when he walked through the bedroom door was look at Dominic, then at Isabella, then at Dominic again, and in that 3-second survey, he clearly absorbed everything that had changed and everything that hadn't and filed all of it away with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that some developments required processing time he didn't currently have. "You're all right," he asked. "We're fine," Dominic said. Marco nodded. "The intruders have cleared the property. Torres is getting medical attention. Reina is mobile, the injury is minor." He paused. Vincent Moreau called the Benedetti meeting 20 minutes ago and pulled Gallo's support out from under him in front of every family at that table. He gave them documentation, financial records, communication logs, everything linking Gallo to the shooting, the security breach, the manufactured debt arrangement. Another pause. Gallo left the meeting before it ended. Nobody followed him. Nobody stopped him. That's a message, Dominic. The families are cutting him loose. It was over. The immediate threat, the political machinery Gallo had spent a year constructing, all of it had collapsed in under an hour because one man had decided at the last possible moment that some things still meant more than survival. Dominic sat with that for exactly as long as he allowed himself. Then, "I need to know where Gallo is." "Working on it," Marco said. "And I need Rafael Reyes found. Tonight. Whatever resources that takes." Marco's eyes moved briefly to Isabella, who had gone very still at the sound of her brother's name. "Understood," he said. He left without another word. The room was quiet again. Different quiet this time, not the darkness of threat, but the particular stillness that follows the passing of something enormous, like the air after a storm clears. Isabella was sitting on the edge of the chair. Her hands were folded, but he could see the tension in them, the white knuckle careful of a person holding themselves together by habit, while something inside threatened to give way. "He'll find him," Dominic said. She looked up. "You don't know that." "I know Marco," he said, "and I know what I've asked for." She nodded, pressed her lips together, looked at the floor. "What if Rafael was part of it?" she said. Her voice was very quiet, the question of someone who has been carrying this possibility for a long time without letting it become words. "What if he knew about the arrangement, about Gallo, about what they intended for you?" "Then we deal with that," Dominic said, simply, directly, "and it doesn't change anything I've already said." She looked at him. "It might change things for me," she said. He understood what she meant, not just the practical complications, but the interior ones, the particular heartbreak of discovering that the person you sacrificed for was not entirely the person you believed them to be. He knew that heartbreak. It lived at a specific address in his personal history with a man named Vincent Moreau. "I know," he said, "but you don't have to know that tonight. Tonight you're here and you're safe and the rest of it can wait." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice so small it was almost not a voice at all, "I'm tired, Dominic. I know. I'm tired of being strong." The simplicity of it landed on him like something physical. Not the drama of collapse, just the quiet, true, unbearable weight of a person who has been holding it together for so long that the effort has become invisible, even to themselves, and admitting it is the hardest thing they have done all day. "Then stop," he said. "For tonight, stop." She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything. "And who holds it together if I stop?" He held her gaze. "I do." The words came out steady. Not a performance, not a promise made to fill a silence. The plain, direct statement of a man who had spent 30 years building a fortress around himself and was now voluntarily opening the gate for one person. Something shifted in her face, moved. The careful steadiness didn't break. She was too much herself for it to break, but it softened. just at the edges, just enough. She leaned her head back against the chair. She closed her eyes. And by degrees, the tension in her shoulders released not all at once, but slowly, the way a fist opens when it finally decides it has nothing left to protect. He watched her breathe. He could not remember the last time he had simply watched someone breathe and felt something other than calculation. He was still watching when her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen. He watched her face change, watched the stillness become something else, something that moved through her like a current, and he knew before she said a word. "Raphael," she breathed. She answered it with the specific trembling speed of someone terrified of being a second too late. "Raphael, Raphael, where are you?" A pause. He could hear a voice on the other end, male, rough, the texture of someone who has been through something and hasn't fully processed the other side of it yet. "Are you hurt? Are you—" Another pause. Longer. Her hand came up to her mouth. When she lowered it, her eyes were wet. But she was smiling, really smiling, the complete unguarded version, and he understood that smiles and tears were not opposing conditions, that sometimes the deepest relief produces both simultaneously because the body doesn't know which way to release it. "He's alive," she said. Her voice was broken and radiant at the same time. "He's in the city. Marco's men found him an hour ago. He's been in a safe house." She swallowed. Gallo was using him, holding him as insurance. "But he's okay, She couldn't finish the sentence. She pressed the phone back to her ear and said her brother's name again, and this time it came out the way names come out when you've been afraid to say them for too long, like releasing something you've been holding in both hands in the dark. Dominic looked away, not because it made him uncomfortable, because it didn't belong to him. That moment was hers entirely, and he would not make it smaller by inserting himself into it. He looked at his own hands instead. The shaking from earlier was gone. The cold fury at Gallo had settled into something colder and more durable, the patient, absolute certainty of a man who had not forgotten and would not forget. The grief of Vincent was still there too, sitting in a chamber of his chest that he'd have to deal with eventually, in whatever way a person deals with the betrayal of someone who was also genuinely beloved. But underneath all of that, underneath the fury and the grief and the calculation in the strategic mind, already moving pieces toward what came next. Something warm, still burning. He heard Isabella say goodbye to her brother. He heard the phone lower. He heard her exhale long, slow, the complete release of something she'd been carrying for 8 months. Then she said his name. Dominic. He looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression he had no precedent for. Not in his life, not in the people who had passed through it, not in any version of himself he had previously inhabited. It was the expression of someone seeing a person clearly, not the title, not the reputation, not the machinery of power and fear that had assembled around him over 30 years. Just the man, the actual man who had stayed awake through 4 nights of pain and refused to ask for help, who had smiled for 4 seconds when she wasn't expecting it, who had called a traitor, his brother, and given him a way out, who had said, "I do like." It was simple, like protecting her was simple, like being a person instead of a force of nature was the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, simple, completely inadequate for everything they contained. And she knew that he could see that she knew it, and she said them anyway, because sometimes the only honest thing you have is the obvious thing. "Don't," he said. "Why not?" "Because if you thank me," he said slowly, each word chosen with a care that was not calculation but something more honest than that, "then this becomes a transaction. And I don't want that." She looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was direct and real and offered without any of the games that questions like that usually carry. Just a woman asking a man the simplest and most complicated thing you can ask another person. He held her gaze for a long moment. He thought about every wall he'd ever built, every door he'd sealed, every version of himself that had been assembled specifically to prevent this exact moment, this exposure, this terrible necessary openness. And then because he was done managing himself into a shape that fit everyone else's expectations, because tonight had burned through the last of his patience for armor, because she had stayed when he'd told her to go and held his hand when he was nothing and looked at him like he was worth seeing. "This," he said, "just that, just this," the chair beside his bed, her eyes on his face, the quiet between them that felt more like home than anything he'd stood in for 30 years. Her breath caught, just barely. Then Marco walked back through the door with the expression of a man who had been awake for 20 hours and had saved his worst news for last. "Gallo's gone," he said. "Left the city an hour ago. Private transport. Unknown destination." A pause. But he didn't go alone. He looked directly at Dominic. He took Chen with him, and Chen had something that belonged to you. "What?" Dominic said. Marco set a photograph on the bed. Printed recent, taken from inside the house. A surveillance still grainy, captured from a camera angle Dominic recognized. It was his room, his bed, the chair, and in the photograph, Isabella's hand was wrapped around his. "He has documentation," Marco said quietly. "Not just the audio recording. Photographic evidence, witness accounts, a full dossier on Isabella's presence here, and your attachment. He's going to use it, not to the families they've already cut him. But there are other audiences, people who would pay significant money to know that Dominic Corsetti's weakness has a face." The warmth in Dominic's chest did not go out, but beside it something old and familiar ignited. The cold, clean fire of a man who had built an empire because someone gave him no choice but to fight. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Isabella. He looked at Marco. "Then we go get him," Dominic said. Marco blinked. "You can't." "Get Gerald on the phone," Dominic said. His voice was quiet and absolute. "Tell him I need to know exactly what it would take to get me out of this bed and into a car." He paused. "Tonight." Marco stared at him. "Tonight, Marco." Marco turned and walked out of the room at a speed that was almost but not quite running. Isabella looked at Dominic. He looked back. And in the silence between them was everything that hadn't been said yet. All the words that belonged to a different conversation, a calmer night, a version of their story that didn't have men in the dark and photographs on beds, and a man running with the only evidence of something fragile and new and worth protecting. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "You could let Marco handle it." "I know. You're going to push yourself past a limit your doctor specifically told you would cause." "Isabella." His voice was gentle. "I know." She stopped. He reached out his hand, the same hand she'd held all night while he slept. The scarred, imperfect 30 years of bad decisions hand. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she put her hand in his. "Okay," she said, the same word as before, the same weight, the same decision hidden inside the simplicity of it. "Okay." He held her hand and he did not let go, and outside somewhere in the city, Carlo Gallo was running with the photograph of this exact moment, and Dominic Corsetti, who had not stood on his own 2 feet in 29 days, was about to get up. Not for his empire, not for his reputation, not for fear or power or the cold architecture of everything he'd built. For this, her hand in his, the ember that hadn't gone out. He was getting up for that. Getting out of the bed took 11 minutes. Gerald, the physical therapist, arrived with the expression of a man who had been woken from sleep and handed something ethically complicated. He stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, looked at Dominic, looked at Isabella, looked back at Dominic and said, "This is against every medical recommendation I have on record." "Noted," Dominic said. "Help me anyway. If you damage the nerve pathway that's been showing progress this week." "Gerald," Dominic's voice was patient and final, "I'm getting up. The question is whether you're here to make sure I do it correctly or whether I do it wrong without you." Gerald made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he crossed the room and started working. The pain was extraordinary. Dominic didn't show it. He showed nothing. He breathed through it with the deliberate, controlled precision of a man who had been hurt before and understood that the body's job was to report damage and his job was to decide what to do with the report. Isabella stood near the door. She didn't watch with the flinching helplessness most people brought to witnessing someone else's pain. She watched the way she watched everything directly, steadily, present without performing presence. When he finally got his legs over the side of the bed and his weight shifted, when gravity after 29 days reintroduced itself to the full length of him, he made a sound that was not quite human and not quite not. Isabella took 1 step forward. He held up a hand, not rejection, a request. "Give me this." Let me have this one thing on my own. She stopped. He sat at the edge of the bed for 30 seconds, breathing. Then he looked at Gerald. Gerald positioned the support, adjusted his grip, and said in the resigned voice of a professional who has lost the argument but intends to win the execution on three. On three, Dominic Corsetti stood up. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't the way a man stands up in a movie, straight and sudden and lit from within. It was slow and labored, and the sweat came immediately, and his legs shook with the particular tremor of muscles relearning a task they'd been forced to forget. He had to grip Gerald's arm, and he hated that, and he did it anyway because pride was a luxury for men who had something to lose by setting it down, and he had already decided what he was and was not willing to lose. He stood. For the first time in 29 days, Dominic Corsetti stood in his own house on his own feet, and the room looked entirely different from up here. Not larger, not more powerful, just different, real. He looked at Isabella. She was looking back at him with her hand pressed flat over her mouth, not to hide distress, but the way people cover their mouths when something moves them past the capacity for a normal face. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough. She lowered her hand. "I'm not doing anything," she said, but her eyes were bright. "You're doing something," he said. "I'm just standing here." "That's the thing," he said. And he didn't elaborate because the elaboration was too large for the moment, and they both understood it without the words. Marco appeared in the doorway. He took in the sight of Dominic standing, took it in the way a man receives confirmation of something he'd hoped for but not counted on, and straightened slightly, professionally, as if recalibrating. "Car's ready," he said. "We have a location on Gallo. He's at the Meridian warehouse, the one off the Port Road. Bought it under a shell 18 months ago. He's got 4 men with him, and he's waiting for transport out of the country." A pause. "Window is maybe 2 hours. "Then we have 2 hours, Dominic said. He took his first step, then another. Gerald stayed close but didn't reach. Dominic moved through the pain with the slow, deliberate momentum of something that has decided to continue regardless of cost, and by the 4th step, his legs had stopped shaking quite so badly. And by the 8th step, something in his spine had remembered an older instruction and was attempting to follow it. And by the time he reached the doorway, he was walking, slowly, with effort, without grace, but walking. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Isabella. "You're staying here," he said. She looked at him calmly. "No." "Isabella, Dominic." She said his name with the exact inflection she'd been using for weeks. Not deferential, not challenging, just honest. "You just stood up for me. The least I can do is stand beside you." Marco turned away. Dominic was fairly certain he was hiding a reaction he considered unprofessional. "If anything happens," Dominic started. "Then it happens to both of us," she said. "That's what beside means." He stared at her. 30 years of building a world where nobody stayed beside him. Where beside was a tactical position, not a human one. Where the word meant proximity to power, not choice. She meant choice, mamas. He let out a breath that carried something with it. Something old. "Stay behind Marco," he said. "Gladly," she said. They moved. The drive to the Port Road was 22 minutes. Dominic sat in the back of the car with Isabella on his left, and Marco's operational voice in his right ear, receiving updates in the clipped shorthand of men in motion. 6 of their people were already in position around the warehouse, 2 more coming from the north. Gerald had sent him with a brace and 2 different medications and the absolutely clear statement that if Dominic was not back in bed within 4 hours, he would personally call every doctor on the Eastern Seaboard. Dominic had said thank you. He'd meant it. He sat in the moving dark and thought about what he was going to say to Carlo Gallo. He'd spent 30 years knowing exactly what to say to every person in every room. He walked into situations with the words already assembled, not because he was dishonest, but because preparation was the only form of respect he'd known how to show to the seriousness of things. You didn't walk into a room without knowing what you needed from it. Tonight he had nothing prepared, because tonight wasn't about what he needed. It was about what he intended to be from this point forward, and that wasn't something you prepared. That was something you arrived at, and they said out loud and let the saying of it make it real. "You're quiet," Isabella said. "I'm thinking," he replied, "about Gallo." "About after Gallo," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What happens after?" He turned his head and looked at her in the dark of the car. "That's what I'm thinking about," he said. "I want to get the answer right." She held his gaze. He could feel her understanding the weight of the sentence, not just the strategic question of what came next for the organization, the territory, the delicate political aftermath of a man like Gallo being neutralized. She understood that the question was larger than that the after he was contemplating included her and her brother and the photograph on his bed, and 11 minutes of getting up off a mattress that had become a prison, and every version of himself he was in the process of deciding to leave behind. "You'll get it right," she said. "How do you know?" She considered. "Because you already know the wrong answer," she said, "and you're not moving toward it." He turned back toward the window. He didn't have a response to that. He didn't need one. When they arrived, Marco got out first. Dominic followed. The walk from the car to the warehouse entrance was not short, and it was not easy, and he made every step of it without asking for help and without pretending it didn't cost him. Isabella walked beside him, not behind, beside, close enough that their arms occasionally touched. She didn't take his arm. She understood that he needed to do this himself, but she was there, the constant warm fact of her, and it steadied him in a way that had nothing to do with balance. Marco's men had already cleared the perimeter. 3 of Gallo's 4 guards had stood down when they had understood the numerical reality of their situation. The 4th had made a different choice and was now being dealt with separately. Gallo himself was inside alone, and according to Torres, who had come, despite the graze, because Torres was constitutionally incapable of sitting out, Gallo had not attempted to run. That itself told Dominic something. Gallo was waiting, which meant Gallo still thought he had a card to play. Dominic walked through the door. Gallo was sitting at a table in the center of the space. He looked older than the last time Dominic had seen him, 6 months, but something more than time had aged him. He was a man in the specific diminishment of a plan that almost worked. He had a phone in front of him and his hands flat on the table, and he looked at Dominic walking toward him with an expression that moved through surprise, then recalculation, then settled into something that tried to be composure and didn't quite make it. "You're standing," Gallo said. "Yes," Dominic replied. He pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, slowly, deliberately. Because standing was the statement, a sitting was the confidence. Gallo's eyes moved past him to where Isabella stood near Marco by the door. Something moved in his face, a recalibration, a reassessment. He'd expected the photograph to be a weapon. He'd expected the evidence of Dominic's feeling for Isabella to be leverage, embarrassment, a crack he could split open. He was looking at it now, the two of them, the specific way they occupied the same space, and understanding that what he had documented was not a weakness. It was a transformation. And transformations could not be leveraged, only witnessed. "You have something of mine," Dominic said. Gallo's hand moved toward the phone on the table. "I have copies," he said, "distributed. If anything happens to me tonight, Carlo." Dominic's voice was calm. "Look at me." Gallo looked. "I'm not here to hurt you," but Dominic said. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Gallo stared at him. Marco stared at him. Even Isabella behind him went completely still. "What?" Gallo said. "I'm not here for revenge," Dominic said. Each word was placed carefully, not from calculation, but from the specific effort of a man saying something he has never said before in his life and wanting to say it correctly. "I'm here because you have material that could endanger someone I care about, and I need it gone. And I'm here to tell you something that I think in your position you need to hear." Gallo's eyes narrowed. "What could you possibly have to tell me?" "That it's over," Dominic said. Simply, directly. "Not just your play, the whole game. The families have cut you. Vincent has given them everything. You have no transport, no allies, no political cover anywhere in this city. Whatever you thought you were building, it's done." He paused. "You can fight that tonight and in this room, and it will end the way it ends. Or you can give me the phone, give me everything you have, and I will let you walk out of this city with your life." Gallo stared at him for a long time. "You're serious," he said. Not with relief, with the stunned incomprehension of a man who had been playing against a version of Dominic Corsetti that no longer existed. "Completely," Dominic said. "Why, how?" Gallo asked. The word came out raw, genuine. The question of a man who had spent so long inside a world that ran on cruelty and transaction, that genuine mercy had become literally incomprehensible to him. "Why would you?" "Because I'm done," Dominic said. "I'm done with all of it, Carlo. The power, the leverage, the endless, exhausting game of who has what on whom. I'm done. He held Gallo's gaze steadily. I almost had to die to understand that. You can take that lesson for free. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Then Gallo picked up the phone. He looked at it for a moment, a man looking at what he'd bet everything on. Then he slid it across the table. There are two more, he said. Backup drives. Torres knows where they are. I told him an hour ago. I don't know why I told him. He stopped. Laughed slightly, without humor. The laugh of a man who has just noticed something about himself that he doesn't entirely like. Maybe I knew this was how you'd ended. Dominic picked up the phone. He stood slowly with effort without asking for help. He looked down at Gallo one last time. Get out of the city, Carlo, he said, and don't come back. He turned and walked toward the door. Isabella fell into step beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The warmth of her beside him was its own complete language, and he was becoming fluent in it. Behind them, he heard Gallo's chair scrape back, the sound of a man standing up and choosing a direction. Dominic didn't look back. He had made his decision and delivered it, and what Gallo did with his life from this point was Gallo's to carry. He was done carrying other people's choices. Outside, the night air hit him, and he stopped walking for a moment. Not from pain, from the specific fullness of a moment that deserves to be felt rather than walked through. He was standing. He was outside. The city was dark and continuous around him, the same city it had always been, and he was a different man inside it than the one who had left it 29 days ago on a stretcher. Marco came and stood beside him. The backup drives are secure, he said. Everything Gallo had, recordings, photographs, documentation, it's all contained. He paused. What do you want to do with the organization? Dominic was quiet for a moment. I need you to set up a meeting, he said. All the lieutenants, 2 days from now, I have some things to say that need to be said in person in front of everyone. Marco nodded slowly. He understood the shape of what was coming, even without the specifics. He was a man who had served Dominic Corsetti for 15 years, and in 15 years he had learned to read the man the way sailors read weather, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of them. And every sign tonight pointed in the same direction. I'll arrange it, Marco said. One more thing, Dominic said. Rafael Reyes. I want him brought somewhere safe tonight. Somewhere his sister can see him in the morning. He paused. Not a safe house. Somewhere that feels like a place, not a precaution. Marco looked at Isabella briefly, then back at Dominic, and for the second time in one night, he turned away before his expression could be identified. Understood, he said. He walked back toward the cars, pulling out his phone. Dominic and Isabella stood in the quiet for a moment. Just the two of them and the night. You let him go, she said. Yes. He tried to kill you. Yes. She was quiet, working through that. Then my father would have said, that's either the bravest thing or the stupidest thing a person can do. What would you say, he asked. She considered. I'd say it's the first thing you've done entirely for yourself, she said. Not for the organization, not for leverage, not for what it would cost or buy, just because it's who you want to be. He looked at her. When did you get so good at reading me? I've been here 2 years, she said. You just started letting me look. He almost smiled, more than almost. The full version, the one that lasted longer than 4 seconds, crossed his face and stayed there, and he didn't manage it or reduce it or put it somewhere appropriate. He just let it exist. I need to sit down, he said. My legs are making some very strong arguments. I know, she said. I've been watching you ignore them for 40 minutes. You could have said something. You would have ignored me too. Yes, he admitted. I absolutely would have. She offered her arm. He looked at it for 1 second, that old pride, that old refusal doing its last bit of work before he set it down for good. Then he took her arm and let her help him back to the car, and it was the most natural thing and the most enormous thing, and it was both at the same time in the way that all the real things are. 2 days later, Dominic Corsetti stood in front of every man who had ever sworn to him. He stood without assistance. He had worked with Gerald every morning since the night at the warehouse, and the progress was real and hard-won, and he stood on his own 2 feet at the head of the table where he had once commanded silence simply by entering a room. He told them the truth. All of it. The shooting Gallo, Vincent, the decisions he had made in a dark bedroom over the course of 29 days, that had changed the direction of everything. He did not soften it, and he did not dramatize it. He spoke the way he'd learned to speak, from a woman in a chair, directly, without performance, with the specific respect for other people's intelligence that comes from actually believing they deserve the truth. He told them he was stepping back from operations, that Marco would assume control of the organizational structure, that there would be a transition period and it would be managed, and no one's position would be compromised by his decision. He told them that the Gallo matter was closed and that anyone who disagreed with that assessment was welcome to bring that disagreement to Marco and not to him, because he was no longer the address for that kind of conversation. He told them he was done. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then one of the older men, a man named Fusco, who had been there since the beginning, who had gray in his hair and a scar across his left hand that matched one of Dominic's own scars from the same night 20 years ago, Fusco nodded. Once. Slowly. The nod of a man who has seen enough of life to recognize a real decision when he sees one. The others followed. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ceremony. The same quiet collective nod of men who respected what they were witnessing, even if they didn't fully understand it. After, in the hallway, Marco stopped him. "You know this doesn't mean they're all going to let you walk away cleanly," Marco said. His voice was low, professional. The last honest report of a man who had served faithfully and would continue to serve just differently. "Some of them will test the boundaries. Some of them will." "I know," Dominic said. "That's why it's you, Marco. Because you understand the boundaries and you know how to hold them, and because you've been running the operation effectively for the last month anyway." He paused. "And because I trust you, which is a thing I don't say easily." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "Don't thank me," Dominic said. "You've earned it 20 times over." He extended his hand. Marco took it. They shook the way men shake hands when the gesture is carrying everything that neither of them is built to say out loud. Isabella was waiting outside. She was standing in the morning light with her arms folded loosely against the cold, and when he came through the door, she turned, and the look on her face was the same look she'd had in the dark car on the way to the port, the one that had saw him entirely without flinching. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's done," he said. She searched his face. "Are you all right?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, the way he'd rarely thought about anything that pertained to his interior state, because his interior state had always been beside the point. "I think so," he said. "Ask me again in a week." "I plan to," she said. And she meant it in every possible direction, not just the question, but the week and the one after, and the fact of her being there to ask it. He stood beside her in the morning, and he did not perform strength, and he did not manage the moment, and he did not calculate what it meant or what it would cut or what it would buy. He was simply there, a man outside on a morning in the city with a woman who had stayed when every reasonable instinct said leave, and who had held his hand in the dark, and who had looked at him like he was worth seeing at the exact moment he'd forgotten how to believe that. The ember hadn't gone out. It had become something larger than an ember now. He didn't have a complete name for it yet, or rather, he had the name and was still getting used to its weight, the specific heft of a word he hadn't carried in so long, he'd forgotten it had any. He would learn to carry it again. He was already learning. 3 weeks later, Rafael Reyes sat at Dominic's kitchen table drinking coffee, and the two men looked at each other across the particular awkward honesty of men who are connected through someone they both love and haven't found their footing with each other yet. Rafael had his sister's eyes, and a wariness that Dominic recognized as the wariness of someone who has been used and is still learning to stand up straight in the aftermath. "You know, I didn't know," Rafael said, not defensive, tired. "About the arrangement about Gallo, I didn't know the full picture." "I know," Dominic said. "I know you know," Rafael said. "I mean, I need to say it anyway." He looked down at his coffee. "And I need to say what you did, finding me, the warehouse, walking out of the thing you built." He stopped, shook his head slowly. "My sister deserves somebody who does things like that." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "she does." "I'm just saying," Rafael said, "don't screw it up." And Dominic looked at this man, this complicated, imperfect man, who had been used as a lever against his sister and had survived it, and was sitting here saying the hardest things, and he almost laughed. The real version, the one that went all the way through. "I'll do my best," he said. He meant it like a vow. That evening, Isabella found him sitting at the window. Not in bed in the chair beside it, the one that had been hers for weeks, and he'd chosen it because it smelled faintly like her, and because some things you allow yourself without justification. She came and stood beside him. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. The city moved outside the glass, continuous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when you have someone to see them with. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Doors," he said. She tilted her head. "I spent 30 years building walls," he said. "I was very good at it. I built them thick and I built them high, and I convinced myself that was architecture, that the walls were the structure, that without them, the whole thing would collapse." He looked out the window. "But they weren't the structure, they were just walls." He turned back to her. "You pressed your hand against one from the other side and it opened." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down. Not in another chair, on the arm of his close enough that her shoulder touched his, and she looked out the window with him, and she said nothing because nothing needed to be said. He reached up and took her hand. She held it the way she'd held it that first night, not clutching, not desperate, just present, warm, certain. The hand of a woman who had decided something and saw no reason to undo the decision. Dominic Corsetti had built his life on fear and had lived inside it for 30 years, and he had lost everything in the span of 3 bullets and then been given back something he hadn't known he was missing. Not his power, not his empire, not the cold, glittering machinery of a world built on control. Just this, a hand in his, a person beside him. The simple, radical, world-altering fact of not being alone. He had been one of the most feared men in the city for 3 decades. He had never until now been free.